Daniel Carter was drowning in credit cards, minimum payments, endless calls. But one notebook and one hard decision changed everything. He cut back to basics, built an emergency fund, and paid it off. Now, he's coast fire. His money grows while he finally breathes. Watch the full story from Credit Card Addict to Coast Fire. The first time Daniel Carter realized he was in trouble, it wasn't when the late fees stacked. It wasn't when the minimum payments climbed so high they swallowed whole paychecks. It was when he stood in a grocery store aisle, staring at a single loaf of bread, and wondered which card would still let him swipe. He was 34 years old, brown hair beginning to thin at the crown, hazel eyes that had once been curious, now dulled by fatigue. His hoodie sleeves were frayed, his jeans sagged at the knees, and his sneakers carried the quiet scuff marks of too many miles walked instead of driven. He looked like a man holding himself together with threadbare fabric, not because he wanted to, but because there was no other option. The cashier had already started scanning the bread. Daniel's hand trembled as he shuffled through his wallet. 6 cards, each with different colors, logos, reward programs he once thought were perks, not traps. All of them carried balances so high they'd begun to blur together. The woman behind him coughed impatiently. A teenager too placed his back snickered. Daniel felt the heat crawl up his neck, flooding his face. He grabbed one card, then another, declining. The cashier's eyes flickered between sympathy and practiced indifference. Finally, the 4th card went through. $3.29 approved. He exhaled like he'd just survived a drowning. And in a way, he had. But the truth hit harder than hunger. This wasn't survival. This was slow suffocation. Daniel hadn't always been this man, jittery, anxious, living in fear of the next decline card. In his 20s, he thought of credit cards as lifelines, tools that gave him freedom. Swipe for gas. Swipe for a new jacket. Swipe for dinner with friends. Because what's $20 when it buys laughter and belonging? He remembered the first card vividly. Silver, embossed with his name. Carter, Daniel J. He ran his thumb across the letters the way other men might trace the lines of a newborn's hand. A symbol of adulthood, he thought. A ticket into the world. The first purchase had been a celebration. A flat-screen TV he didn't need but wanted. It felt like power. Like magic. Tap plastic. Take treasure. Pay later. Always later. And when the bills came, he paid the minimums. That was enough, wasn't it? That's what they told him. That's what the commercials promised. The smiling couples booking trips to Cancun with rewards points. But points didn't feed him. And soon, neither did his paycheck. That night, after the grocery store humiliation, Daniel sat in his dim apartment, a one-bedroom cave with peeling paint and humming pipes. The air smelled faintly of damp carpet. The only light came from a single desk lamp, its bulb flickering like it too was tired of holding on. He spread his credit card bills across the table. Paper walls closing in. APR 22.99%. Balance $7,400. APR 18.5%. Balance $3,122. APR 24.9%. Balance $12,800. His total debt stared at him like a sentence. $46,378. Nearly twice his annual salary. He rubbed his temples. His hands were rough from his warehouse job. Long shifts of lifting, loading, sweating under fluorescent lights for $17.25 an hour. The job kept him fed, barely, but it didn't feed hope. Daniel leaned back in his chair. The ceiling leaked faint shadows. His chest ached, not with the sharp stab of a heart attack, but with the slow, grinding pressure of dread. "How did I get here?" he whispered. The silence offered no reply. Debt doesn't arrive with sirens. It doesn't knock at your door and announce, "You're sinking." It comes disguised as convenience. A $6 coffee. A $19 streaming bundle. A $250 impulse flight to visit friends. "You deserve it," the commercials sang. "Buy now, pay later." And Daniel believed them. Because when you're tired, when you're lonely, when the world feels heavy, a swipe feels like relief. He never called himself an addict. Addicts were people who needed meetings, who lost jobs, who stumbled drunk into alleyways. He was different. He was working. He was managing. But the truth was harsher. He wasn't managing. The cards were managing him. Each decision was filtered through them. Could he afford dinner? Not the real question. The question was, would the card let it through? Could he afford rent? Not yet. But maybe if he shuffled balances, moved debt here, borrowed there. Like scooping water from a sinking boat with a cracked cup. It was no longer spending. It was gambling with survival. That winter, Daniel's car broke down. Transmission failure. $1,900 repair. The mechanic's voice was steady, rehearsed, as though he'd delivered the sentence 1,000 times. Daniel's knees buckled. He sat on the curb outside the shop, icy wind cutting across his face. His hands shook as he dialed his bank, begging for an increase on his credit limit. Denied. He called another card company. Denied. For the first time in years, he felt naked, stripped of the illusion of plastic protection. He took the bus home that night. The cold metal seat vibrated under him, each stoplight dragging the minutes longer. Around him, strangers stared at their phones, earbuds sealing them in worlds Daniel couldn't enter. He felt invisible, disposable, a man no one would remember if he disappeared between stops. At home, he collapsed onto his mattress. No bed frame, just a mattress on the floor. He buried his face into the thin pillow, his body shaking with a grief that had no words. That night, Daniel made a decision. Not a solution. He wasn't there yet. But a decision. He would not live like this anymore. The scene closes with Daniel at his cluttered kitchen table, pen scratching across a torn piece of notebook paper. For the first time, he wasn't writing a payment. He was writing a plan. A budget. Primitive, messy, desperate. But it was his. And that was the beginning. Daniel stared at the notebook on his kitchen table, like it was an opponent. The paper wasn't blank anymore. He had scrawled numbers down its lines, messy and uneven, as though even his handwriting wanted to escape. In, $2,120. Out, rent, $850. Utilities, $140. Car insurance, $90. Groceries, $250. Gas, $180. Phone, $60. Credit card minimums, $870. The math was merciless. His income, modest but steady from the warehouse, looked decent enough on the first line. By the time he reached the bottom of the column, the ink might as well have bled into red. Negative balance. A monthly deficit that explained the stack of bills, the feeling of drowning. He rubbed his face with both hands, smudging the stubble along his jaw. Numbers didn't care about effort. Numbers didn't care that he worked overtime shifts or skipped dinners. They only told the truth, and the truth was ugly. Still, the notebook was different from the bills. The bills were accusations. The notebook, though brutal, was at least his voice. His attempt to wrestle chaos into form. He thought of the bread incident at the grocery store. The sting of humiliation still lingered. That memory had driven him to pick up the pen. If shame could build walls, maybe discipline could build doors. The first week was clumsy. Daniel kept the notebook in his backpack, pulling it out during lunch breaks. He tracked every dollar. The $4 gas station coffee he shouldn't have bought, the $9 sandwich when he forgot to pack lunch. Each time he wrote an expense, it felt like confessing a sin. By Friday, the list of out sprawled across 2 pages. The total nearly $90 on food outside the home. He stared at it in disbelief. $90. Almost a utility bill, gone in paper cups and deli wrappers. It was a revelation, though not the uplifting kind. He had always believed the problem was big purchases, the TV, the repairs, the plane ticket to Vegas years ago that still haunted his balance. But here it was, in black ink. The little things were bleeding him dry, not the occasional splurge. That weekend, Daniel attempted what he called the purge. No spending at all. He stayed inside his apartment, determined to eat through the canned goods gathering dust in his cupboard. Breakfast, beans and rice. Lunch, beans and rice. Dinner, slightly different beans and rice. By Sunday night, he sat on his couch, stomach heavy but unsatisfied and mood sour. The silence of his phone was unbearable. He had declined every invitation, fearing temptation. His notebook lay on the table, blank for 2 days, but his chest felt tighter, not lighter. He realized then that budgeting couldn't just be about punishment. If it was, he'd quit before it began. Monday morning at the warehouse, Daniel carried his notebook into the break room. He sat on the table, opened to a fresh page, and wrote across the top, "Plan, not prison." He started small. 5 categories: Rent, food, transportation, debt, everything else. He gave himself a modest cash allowance for groceries and scribbled rules in the margins. Cook at home. No takeout unless emergency. For transportation, he cut the gas budget in half. He'd walk to work at least 2 days a week, even if it added 20 minutes. For debt, he circled the number $870 in red, his minimum payments. It was more than he could afford, but he would not let them slip. The hardest part was the everything else column. Clothing, entertainment, gifts. He wrote $0. He stared at it for minutes. Could he really live without movies, without birthday presents for his niece, without the occasional beer? The truth was cruel, but so was the debt. He swallowed hard and closed the notebook. The first 2 weeks with his plan were shaky. On the third day, he gave in to a $7 fast food burger after work. The grease felt comforting in the moment, shameful after. He scrawled in the notebook with bold letters, underlining it twice. His pen nearly tore the paper. But other victories were real. He walked to work 3 times. The January wind froze his face, but the silence gave him time to think. He cooked pasta and sauce from scratch, bland but cheap. He avoided the aisles of the grocery store that whispered promises of snacks and soda. At night, when loneliness pressed hardest, he opened the notebook and read his own messy handwriting. It wasn't inspiration, but it was proof. He was trying. The first real spark of hope came unexpectedly. On a Friday, Daniel logged into his bank account to check his balance before rent was withdrawn. For months, the sight had been the same, a dwindling number, often frighteningly close to zero. But this time, something shifted. There was $127 left after paying his bills. Not much, barely a cushion. But for Daniel, it felt like a fortune. It was the first time in years he had money left before the month ended. He sat back, staring at the screen. His lips twitched into a smile. It wasn't relief exactly, but something softer, more fragile. Possibility. He grabbed his notebook and wrote in capital letters, "This works." That night, he didn't celebrate with takeout or drinks. He didn't buy anything at all. Instead, he sat at his desk, flipping through the old pages filled with shame and deficit, and compared them to this moment. The contrast was sharp. It wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was discipline, fragile, imperfect discipline, but discipline nonetheless. Over the next month, Daniel began experimenting. He tried packing his lunch every day, tallying how much he saved. He tested walking not just to work but to the grocery store, a 25-minute trek that forced him to buy only what he could carry. He kept receipts in an envelope, sorted by category, like trophies of restraint. The process was messy, frustrating. Some days, he wanted to throw the notebook across the room. Other days, the act of writing a number in ink gave him a sense of control he hadn't felt in years. The debt didn't shrink overnight. The balances remained, heavy as ever. But Daniel noticed something subtle. The anxiety shifted. Instead of fearing the unknown, he was staring at the known. And even if the known was ugly, it was his to wrestle with. He realized something profound in that second month. Budgets weren't prisons. They were maps. And for the first time in years, he wasn't lost. The change in Daniel wasn't obvious to others. His coworkers still saw a man in scuffed shoes, unloading boxes. His landlord still saw a tenant scraping by. His family, when he called, still worried about him. But inside, something was cracking open. One afternoon, as he walked home from work with his backpack heavy on his shoulders, he passed a storefront he used to frequent. Electronics, glossy and tempting, advertised the newest gadgets. For years, Daniel would step inside, swipe a card, and feel the rush of acquisition. This time, he slowed, looked at the glowing displays, and kept walking. The craving was there, sharp as always. But the notebook in his bag felt heavier than the temptation. The numbers had spoken louder. It was a small victory, invisible to the world. To Daniel, it was monumental. Daniel sat at his kitchen table late one night, the desk lamp humming. His notebook lay open, filled with pages of scribbled plans and crossed-out mistakes. He flipped to the first page, where he had once written the word plan in all caps. Beside it, he added another word, hope. The numbers were still against him. The mountain was high, but at the bottom of the climb, Daniel had found his first foothold, and for the first time, he believed he could move upward. Daniel had thought the notebook would be the hardest part. The math, the discipline, the endless tallying. But as weeks turned into months, he discovered something more difficult. Facing himself. On the surface, the numbers were improving. He wasn't debt-free, not even close, but the chaos had slowed. The grocery store humiliation hadn't repeated. He built small buffers. He was tracking every dollar, carrying receipts like they were medals from a private war. But some nights, alone in his apartment, Daniel would feel the old hunger. Not for food, not for survival, but for escape. His hands itched for his wallet, for the swipe that used to make problems disappear, at least for a moment. One evening in March, he caught himself staring at a credit card he hadn't cut up yet. It sat on the counter, a glossy rectangle of temptation. He picked it up, running his thumb over the raised numbers. The urge to use it pulsed through him, irrational but powerful. Buy something. Anything. Prove to yourself you're not trapped. He didn't. He sat back down. But the craving disturbed him. It wasn't about need. It was about identity. The next day, during a break at the warehouse, Daniel opened his notebook not to record an expense, but to ask a question. He wrote in block letters across the top of the page. Why do I spend? The silence in the break room was heavy. A vending machine hummed in the corner. The question stared back at him, more uncomfortable than any balance sheet. He thought back to the first credit card, the silver one he'd admired like a trophy. What had he bought? A TV. Why? Because it made him feel grown up, important, in control. He flipped forward through the years in his memory. The dinners he couldn't afford, paid for with plastic. The vacations booked on points that never quite cover the costs. The gadgets, the clothes, the quick fixes. Each swipe had been less about the item, more about the feeling. The rush of power. The illusion of belonging. The silence it filled. Daniel tapped his pen against the page. He wrote the words slowly, almost painfully. I spent because I felt empty. He stared at the sentence, ashamed. But at the same time, it felt like opening a window in a suffocating room. Money wasn't just math. It was memory, emotion, wounds. When Daniel was a kid, his parents had fought constantly about money. He remembered his father slamming bills on the table, shouting about overdrafts. He remembered his mother's quiet tears in the kitchen, counting cash that never stretched far enough. They hadn't taught him how to budget, how to save, how to invest. They had taught him, without meaning to, that money was pain. And when he became an adult, he had run as far from that pain as he could, straight into the arms of easy credit. It made sense now. He hadn't just been swiping for things. He had been swiping to rewrite his past, to prove he was different, to silence the voice that said he would always struggle. But plastic silence was temporary. The echoes always returned. That weekend, Daniel tried something new. Instead of shutting out the cravings, he sat with them. He brewed a pot of cheap coffee, sat at his table, and pulled the notebook toward him. Whenever he felt the urge to buy something, online, in a store, anywhere, he wrote it down. Not the purchase, the emotion. Saturday morning, saw new sneakers online. Wanted them because I felt tired of looking poor. Saturday afternoon, almost bought fast food. Really, I just didn't want to cook alone again. Sunday night, browsed Amazon. Wanted to buy books I won't read. Felt bored, restless. By Sunday night, the list covered a full page. None of it had to do with necessity. All of it was about feelings. Daniel put the pen down, staring at the pattern. Shame swelled, but underneath it was something else, clarity. This was his real debt, not just the $46,000 on paper. The debt of using money as medicine. The following week, he took another risk. He spoke it out loud. A coworker named Javier, a wiry man with kind eyes, had noticed Daniel's new habits, the packed lunches, the walks instead of rides, the way he scribbled in his notebook during breaks. One day, as they sat on crates near the loading dock, Javier asked, "You tracking something?" Looked serious. Daniel hesitated. For years, he had hidden his struggles, pretended, lied. But something about Javier's tone, free of judgment, loosened his defenses. "I'm trying to get out of debt," Daniel admitted. Javier nodded slowly. "Yeah? Credit cards." Daniel looked up sharply. "How'd you know?" Javier chuckled softly. "Because I've been there. Maxed out 3 of them by the time I was 30. Took me 6 years to crawl out." Daniel blinked. The admission stunned him. He had always assumed he was alone in his shame, the only fool drowning in balances. Hearing someone else confess felt like the ground shifting. "How'd you do it?" Daniel asked quietly. "First thing," Javier said, leaning back, "I had to stop lying to myself. Stop pretending the spending was about things. It was about how I felt. Once I figured that out, I could fight it." The words echoed Daniel's notebook. He felt a strange mix of relief and kinship. Maybe he wasn't broken. Maybe he was just human. That night, Daniel wrote a new line at the top of his notebook. "Money is emotional. Learn the emotion. Change the story." It became a mantra. Each time he felt the urge to swipe, he paused and asked, "What am I really feeling?" Some days it was loneliness. Other days, boredom. Often, it was exhaustion. Naming the feeling didn't erase it, but it weakened it, like turning on the light in a room that once terrified him. Slowly, the cravings began to shift. They didn't vanish. He still longed for the quick high of buying, but they lost some of their power. One evening in April, Daniel stood in front of a store window, staring at a jacket he didn't need. His reflection in the glass looked worn, tired, older than his years. He felt the familiar itch. Buy it. Feel better. Look better. Prove you're not poor. But then, for the first time, he really looked at his reflection. He didn't see just a man in need of clothes. He saw the weight in his posture, the years of running from himself. And he asked silently, would this jacket fix that? The answer was immediate. No. He turned away, pulling his hoodie tighter around his shoulders. He walked home, empty-handed but strangely proud. That night, he recorded the moment in his notebook, underlining it twice. Didn't buy the jacket. Faced the feeling instead. It was a small line, but to Daniel, it felt monumental. A victory not of dollars, but of dignity. The change wasn't linear. Some nights, he gave in. A late-night pizza delivery after a long shift, a cheap gadget he justified as useful. But each slip no longer felt like proof of failure. It was data, information, something to learn from. Slowly, he began to understand. This journey wasn't just about crushing debt. It was about rebuilding trust with himself. And as spring turned to summer, Daniel noticed something subtle. His shoulders straightened when he walked. His eyes met the cashier's more easily. He still carried debt, still faced a mountain, but he also carried awareness. And awareness, he realized, was its own kind of wealth. Daniel sat on his balcony one evening, sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. He had his notebook in his lap, pages filled with both numbers and emotions. He flipped to the page where he had once written, "I spent because I felt empty." He traced the words with his finger, then added beneath them, "I saved because I want to feel whole." The debt was still there. The work ahead was still long. But for the first time, Daniel felt like he wasn't just fixing his finances. He was fixing himself. Daniel Carter had been tracking his expenses for nearly 4 months when he hit a wall. The notebook told him the truth. He was stabilizing. He wasn't falling deeper into debt. His spending had slowed. He even had tiny leftovers at the end of the month. But looking at the balances, the mountain of numbers that clung to him like a second shadow, he felt a familiar wave of despair. $46,000. That was still the number. He could chip at it with minimum payments forever, but the balances barely moved. 1 month's progress was erased by another month's interest. Late one night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the spread of bills. He'd organized them by size, smallest to largest. One card with $1,122. Another with $3,044. Another with $7,800. Then the monsters, balances in the tens of thousands. It was like lining up opponents in a fight. And Daniel knew, looking at the list, that he couldn't knock them all down at once. He needed a strategy. The breakthrough came in the most unlikely place, a YouTube video. Daniel had been searching for budgeting tips. Late at night, the glow of his laptop painting his tired face. One title caught his eye, "The Debt Snowball Method Explained." The speaker was animated, sharp, almost too enthusiastic. Daniel nearly clicked away. But then the explanation unfolded, simple and clear. Pay minimums on everything, but attack the smallest debt with every spare dollar. Wipe it out, then roll that freed-up payment into the next debt, and the next, building momentum like a snowball rolling downhill. It sounded almost too simple. He leaned back, skeptical. Wouldn't it make more sense to hit the highest interest first? He muttered to himself. But then the speaker said something that pierced him. This is about psychology, not just math. You need quick wins to stay in the fight. Quick wins. That phrase echoed in Daniel's chest. He thought of his past attempts at budgeting, the failures, the relapses. Every time, it was the lack of progress that crushed him. The mountain looked too high, the climb too endless. But what if the key wasn't climbing the mountain all at once? What if it was toppling the pebbles first? The next morning, Daniel flipped to a clean page in his notebook. He titled it in bold letters, Debt Snowball. He listed every debt, smallest to largest. Card 1, $1,122. Card 2, $3,044. Card 3, $7,800. Card 4, $12,500. Card 5, $21,912. He circled the first one, the $1,122. That's the target, he whispered. It wasn't glamorous. It wouldn't free him from all debt. But for the first time, he felt like he had a plan that wasn't just about surviving. It was about winning, one small battle at a time. The next weeks were war. Daniel cut deeper into his spending than ever before. He stopped buying coffee entirely, brewing weak cups at home, and carrying them in a dented thermos. He sold an old guitar that had gathered dust in the corner for $60. He canceled a streaming service, borrowing DVDs from the library instead. Every dollar he could scrape together, he funneled toward Card 1. Some nights, it felt pointless. The progress was slow. $50 here, $70 there. But each time he logged into his account and saw the balance shrink, even by a fraction, something inside him stirred. Momentum. At work, Javier noticed Daniel's intensity. You look like a man training for a marathon, Javier joked one afternoon. Daniel grinned faintly. Feels like it. What's the plan? That snowball, Daniel said, almost proudly. I'm wiping out the little ones first. Javier nodded with approval. Smart. Those quick wins matter. Trust me, the first time you see a balance hit zero, you'll feel unstoppable. Daniel hoped he was right. By June, after weeks of sacrifice, Daniel logged into his bank account and stared at the screen. Card 1 balance, $0. He blinked, refreshing the page to be sure. The number held steady. He sat back in his chair, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His chest felt lighter, his shoulders looser. He just paid off his first debt in full. It wasn't all of them, not even close, but it was proof. Proof that he could move the needle. He grabbed his notebook, flipped to the debt snowball page, and drew a thick line through Card 1, $1,122. The act was almost ceremonial, like breaking chains, one link at a time. The celebration was quiet. Daniel didn't go out. He didn't buy anything. Instead, he poured himself a glass of tap water, raised it in a mock toast to the empty room, and whispered, one down. The loneliness of the moment was sharp, but so was the pride. He didn't need applause. He didn't need a medal. He needed to remember this feeling, to let it fuel the next battle. Because the snowball had started to roll. The months that followed were grueling, but different. With Card 1 gone, the $50 minimum payment that had once bled him dry was now a weapon. He redirected it toward Card 2. Along with his extra savings, he attacked the $3,044 balance with fresh determination. The progress was faster this time. The momentum real. Each payment chipped more than just numbers. It chipped at the old identity he carried, the man who couldn't change. He began to notice subtle shifts in his mindset. At the grocery store, he didn't just ask, "Can I afford this?" He asked, "Would I rather have this bag of chips, or would I rather be free?" Often, freedom won. One night, while sorting through his bills, Daniel caught himself smiling. Smiling at a pile of debt. The absurdity struck him, and he laughed out loud. It wasn't joy in the bills themselves. It was joy in knowing he was finally fighting back. For years, the paper had been his enemy. Now it was his scoreboard. He scribbled in his notebook. That isn't just math. It's momentum, and momentum is power. By late summer, Daniel had paid off Card 2 as well. 2 balances gone. 2 chains broken. He wasn't free yet, far from it. But when he sat at his table, looking at the shrinking list of debts, he felt something he hadn't in years. Control. The snowball was rolling downhill now, gathering weight, gathering speed. And Daniel, for the first time, felt like he wasn't running from debt. He was chasing it down. Daniel Carter's victories had been quiet ones. The crossed-out debts in his notebook, the first card wiped clean, the second soon to follow. They were milestones he celebrated with nothing more than a glass of water or a satisfied scribble across a page. But victories that live only in notebooks are fragile. The real test came not at the kitchen table, but outside, in a world that never stopped selling, never stopped inviting, never stopped tempting. It began with a simple text message. "Hey man, it's been a while. Friday night, burgers and beers with the crew." The message was from Chris, an old friend from high school. Daniel stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen. He wanted to go. God, he wanted to go. For months he had lived inside his budget like a monk in a cell. Walk to work, eat rice and beans, cancel streaming, cancel music subscriptions, cancel fun. His world had grown small, defined by notebooks and balances. But the snowball was rolling now, and momentum was precious. Nights out meant money. Money meant delays. Delays meant defeat. He typed, deleted, retyped. Finally. Can't this time. Tight on cash. Rain check. The reply came seconds later. Bro, it's just one night. You gotta live a little. Daniel set the phone face down, heart pounding. The words stung. Live a little. As if he hadn't been alive these past months. As if living only counted when money was spent. But a part of him believed it. That Friday night, instead of laughter and beer, Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table. He ate pasta with cheap sauce, his phone buzzing occasionally with group photos of his friends at the bar. Smiling faces, pitchers of beer, plates stacked high with burgers. He scrolled through them, the ache of loneliness gnawing at his chest. Then he opened his notebook. He flipped to the debt snowball page, where 2 lines had already been crossed out. He traced them with his finger, grounding himself. Not yet, he whispered, but soon. The tension didn't stop there. At work, Daniel's co-workers had noticed his frugality. They ordered takeout for lunch, while he unpacked his Tupperware of beans and rice. They teased him lightly, at first with jokes about being Mr. Healthy or Mr. Cheap. One afternoon, as they passed around menus for a pizza order, someone laughed. "Come on, Carter, live a little. It's only $10. Only $10. He heard the phrase like an echo of Chris's text. He wanted to laugh it off, to join in, to feel part of the group. But he shook his head gently, tapping his lunch bag. "I'm good, thanks." The teasing didn't stop, but it softened when Javier spoke up. "Leave him be. Man's on a mission." The others chuckled, returning to their menus. But Daniel caught Javier's eye and saw something there. Respect. Quiet, unspoken, but real. That look carried him through the rest of the day. Still, the hardest battles weren't fought against friends or co-workers. They were fought against himself. On Saturday evenings, when the city outside his window buzzed with laughter and nightlife, Daniel would sit in silence, notebook open, pen in hand, trying to convince himself that solitude was strength. But some nights it just felt like loneliness. He would browse old photos on his phone, vacations with friends, concerts, dinners out. Each picture carried a double edge. Joy in the moment, regret in the balance that followed. He remembered one night in particular, years ago, when he'd treated everyone at the table to drinks on his card. The smiles, the thanks, the warmth of belonging. It had cost him $120, a number that still lingered on his balance sheet, accumulating interest with every passing month. Belonging, he realized, had always been expensive. But now the price felt too high. Daniel began experimenting with alternatives. Instead of turning down every invitation, he suggested cheaper options. Coffee instead of dinner. Walk in the park instead of drinks. Some friends agreed, others drifted away. The circle grew smaller, but more genuine. With Javier, he found a new kind of companionship. The 2 men began taking lunch breaks together, eating their packed meals on the loading dock. They traded stories. Javier about his years clawing out of debt, Daniel about the humiliations and small wins of his current journey. "People think debt is numbers," Javier said one afternoon, biting into his sandwich. "It's not. It's relationships. With yourself. With others. You change those, the numbers follow." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling the truth sink in. The real test came in July, on his niece's birthday. Daniel adored her, a bright-eyed 7-year-old who ran into his arms each time he visited. In the past, he had spoiled her with toys and gadgets, charging gifts he couldn't afford just to see her smile. This year, he had promised himself it would be different. But standing in the toy aisle of the store, surrounded by colorful boxes and blinking lights, his resolve wavered. A dollhouse caught his eye, glittering plastic walls and miniature furniture. $79.99. He imagined her joy, her laughter, the way she would hug him. He imagined the photos, the memories. Then he imagined the bill, the snowball slowing, the victory erased. He stood there for nearly 20 minutes, torn between love and discipline. Finally, he walked out, empty-handed, but not defeated. The next day, he visited his sister's house with a small gift, a handmade coupon book, filled with promises of time instead of toys. One afternoon at the park, one movie night with Uncle Daniel, one trip for ice cream. His niece squealed with delight, hugging him tight. His sister's eyes softened with understanding. It wasn't about the money. It was about presence. And for the first time, Daniel realized he could give without debt. The loneliness never vanished entirely. There were still nights when the world outside felt too bright, too full, too tempting. But each time he said no, each time he chose a notebook over the bar tab, the muscle of discipline grew stronger. And slowly, Daniel began to see the truth. Belonging bought with money was fragile. Belonging earned with honesty, with presence, with integrity, that was priceless. By the end of summer, Daniel Snowball had cleared 2 debts, and he was chipping hard at the third. But more than numbers, he had discovered something deeper. The cost of belonging wasn't worth the chains of debt. He still wanted friends, laughter, nights out. He still wanted to live. But he no longer believed that living meant spending. And though the world around him still called, still tempted, still whispered, Daniel had found his answer. No, not yet. I'm building something bigger. The summer heat pressed down on the city, thick and relentless. Daniel Carter trudged home from the warehouse, sweat soaking his faded hoodie, his legs heavy from another 10-hour shift. But despite the exhaustion, there was a lightness to his step. 2 debts down, the snowball rolling. For the first time in years, he felt momentum. Then, like a thief in the night, reality struck. It happened on a Tuesday evening in August. Daniel's car, the old sedan he depended on for groceries, errands, and the occasional visit to his sister's house, sputtered and died in the parking lot outside his apartment. He turned the key again and again, but the engine groaned in protest. His heart sank. By the next morning, the mechanic had his verdict: a busted alternator. Cost of repair? $480. Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't have $480. He barely had $80. His paychecks were already spoken for. Every dollar marched dutifully toward bills and debts. And so, with no cushion, no buffer, no choice, he reached for the credit card he swore he'd never touch again. Swipe. Just like that, the snowball slowed. One victory undone in a single transaction. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the repair receipt beside him. He buried his face in his hands, frustration burning hot in his chest. All his discipline, all his sacrifice, and still, he was vulnerable. One breakdown, one accident, one bad day, and debt had him again. It wasn't just about paying things off, he realized. It was about protection. Without savings, he was building his financial house on sand. He opened his notebook and wrote furiously across a fresh page. Need an emergency fund. The words looked simple, almost childish. But to Daniel, they were revolutionary. The concept wasn't new. He had heard the phrase tossed around in articles and videos before, but it had always seemed like a luxury. Who has money left over to save when you're drowning in debt? He used to scoff. But the alternator had answered him. He couldn't afford not to save. He set a new goal, $1,000. A tiny cushion, enough to shield him from the next car repair, the next medical bill, the next small disaster waiting in the shadows. It felt impossible, but so had paying off the first car once. The following weeks, Daniel restructured his life with ruthless precision. He cut his grocery budget further, experimenting with bulk buying, rice, beans, oats, pasta, stretching meals into weeks. He learned to cook simple, hearty stews that lasted for days. He sold things he didn't need. A set of weights gathering dust under his bed. A coffee maker he hadn't touched since switching to instant. old jackets that no longer fit. Each sale was small, but each dollar flowed into a new envelope labeled Emergency Fund. At work, he volunteered for every overtime shift offered. The extra hours wore his body down, but when the paycheck came, he split it deliberately. Minimums to debt, scraps to the emergency envelope. Slowly, the stack of bills grew. Tens became 20s. 20s became hundreds. The process wasn't just about money. It was about mindset. Each time he dropped a bill into the envelope, Daniel felt a strange mix of relief and power. He was no longer waiting for disaster to strike. He was preparing for it. He thought about his childhood, about watching his parents fight over every unexpected bill. He remembered his father's face, red with anger, his mother's tears. Their lack of a safety net had torn holes in more than just their finances. It had torn holes in their family. Daniel swore he wouldn't repeat that story. By October, the envelope held $600. The sight of it stunned him. $600, untouched, waiting. In his past life, that money would have vanished in a takeout, gadgets, or bar tabs. Now it sat like a shield, humming with possibility. The first test came sooner than expected. One night, his sister called. "Daniel, I hate to ask, but could you watch Mia tomorrow? I've got an emergency shift." He agreed without hesitation. The next day, he and his niece walked to the park, laughing as they chased each other across the grass. On the way home, Mia spotted an ice cream truck. Daniel froze for a moment. In the past, he would have charged the treat, not thinking twice. But now he had a choice. He pulled out a $5 bill from his wallet, not from the emergency fund, but from his careful weekly cash allowance. He handed it to the vendor, bought 2 cones, and sat with his niece on the curb, watching the sunset melt into orange and pink. It wasn't about the ice cream. It was about freedom. For once, the purchase didn't carry shame. It carried joy. By November, the envelope was full, $1,000. Daniel held the cash in his hands, fanned it out like a deck of cards, and felt a surge of pride. He slipped it into a small fireproof box under his bed, locking it away. For the first time in his adult life, he had a safety net. The debt was still there, heavy and persistent, but now he had armor. The next alternator, the next flat tire, the next surprise wouldn't send him back to square one. And with that realization came something deeper, peace. The anxiety that had haunted him, the dread of the unknown, eased. He could breathe again. He wasn't invincible, but he was resilient. That night, he sat on his balcony, sipping coffee from his chipped mug, and wrote in his notebook, "Debt freedom is the goal. Savings is a shield. Both matter." He underlined it twice. Daniel's debt snowball still loomed large. But now, alongside it, he had something new, the beginnings of stability. The $1,000 in his box wasn't just cash. It was confidence. It was protection. It was proof that he didn't have to live on the edge of panic anymore. For the first time, he wasn't just fighting the past. He was preparing for the future. Daniel Carter never thought of himself as an investor. Investors were people in suits, men and women with slick hair and confident strides, people who spoke in acronyms and numbers that rolled off their tongues like a second language. Daniel was a warehouse worker, a man with calloused hands and a second-hand car that still groaned on cold mornings. But one evening in December, he found himself sitting at his kitchen table with his chipped coffee mug, notebook open, staring at a question he'd never dared write before. What comes after debt? For months, his world had been narrowed to the snowball, to crossing out balances, to scraping together dollars. And it was working. 2 debts gone, a third shrinking fast, a small emergency fund tucked away under his bed. But debt, he realized, was a battle of defense. What about offense? If he ever wanted true freedom, not just survival, he would need more than discipline. He would need growth. The idea terrified him. He remembered watching his father, years ago, slam a newspaper on the table during the dot-com crash. "Scam. Whole thing's a scam," his father had shouted, waving charts and headlines. The family lost what little they had in a retirement account, and the bitterness never left. Investing, in Daniel's mind, was gambling in a suit. But Javier had planted a seed weeks earlier. During one of their lunch breaks, the older man had said casually, "Debt's the storm. Saving's a shelter. But investing? That's planting seeds. That's how you make sure you don't just survive, but grow." Daniel had nodded then, but the words had lingered. Planting seeds. And now, staring at his notebook, he wondered what kind of life he might grow. The research began clumsily. Late nights, Daniel hunched over his old laptop, typing nervous questions into the search bar. Best investments for beginners. Is investing safe? Index funds explained simple. He fell into a maze of blogs, forums, and videos. Some promised riches, others screamed about scams. But slowly, a pattern emerged. The quiet, steady voices cutting through the noise. Voices that spoke of long-term growth, of patience, of the power of time in the market. The phrase that stuck with him was one he saw again and again: compound interest. At first, it sounded abstract, mathematical. But then he watched a video that broke it down visually. A simple chart, lines growing steeper with each passing decade. Money not just added, but multiplied. It was like watching a snowball roll downhill again. But this time, it grew in his favor. The next day, Daniel brought it up with Javier. "You ever invest?" he asked hesitantly, as they sat on the loading dock. Javier smiled knowingly. "Took me a long time to trust it. But yeah, index funds, retirement account. Boring stuff, but boring is good." Index funds, Daniel echoed. "Think of it like a basket," Javier explained. "Instead of betting on one company, you own a little piece of hundreds. The market goes up, you go up. Slowly, steadily. Not gambling. More like planting seeds in a field you know will grow." Daniel frowned. "But what if the market crashes?" "It will," Javier said simply. "And then it will rise again. That's the game. The trick is to stay in. To trust time more than fear." The words settled into Daniel's chest. Trust time. That night, Daniel wrote in his notebook. Debt is chains. Savings is armor. Investing is wings. The thought scared him, but it also thrilled him. January arrived with biting cold. Daniel's snowball had knocked out another debt, leaving only 2 towering balances. The emergency fund still sat safely under his bed. And one evening, after weeks of hesitation, he opened a new tab on his laptop and typed, "How to open an index fund account." The process felt surreal. Filling out forms, linking his checking account, choosing his first fund. His palms sweated as he clicked each confirmation. When the final screen appeared, account created successfully, he leaned back in his chair, heart racing. It was official. He was an investor. Not much. Not yet. Just $50, transferred automatically into the fund each month. But it was a start, a seed in the soil. The first month, he checked the account obsessively. The number wavered, up $2, down 3. Panic flared. Was he losing money already? He almost canceled the automatic transfer. But then he remembered Javier's voice. Trust time. So he let it ride. By the 3rd month, the balance was still small, but it had grown. Not by much, but enough to spark wonder. For the first time in his life, money was working for him instead of against him. It felt like magic. Quiet, steady magic. The lesson came full circle one snowy afternoon. Daniel was visiting his sister's house when his niece, Mia, asked for help with a school project. "We're growing beans in jars," she explained, holding up a glass with damp cotton and a tiny sprout. Daniel crouched beside her, studying the fragile green shoot. "See, Uncle Daniel," she said proudly. "You can't see it for days, but then suddenly it grows." He smiled softly, ruffling her hair. "Yeah, kiddo, that's exactly how it works." Driving home later, he couldn't stop thinking about that little sprout. Investing wasn't about instant riches. It was about patience, about faith in growth you couldn't see day to day. Like Mia's bean, like his snowball, like his future. Daniel's debts still loomed large, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just clawing his way out of the past anymore. He was planting seeds for the future. The account balance was tiny, the progress slow, but the principle was powerful. For the first time, his money wasn't just escaping him. It was growing. And with each automatic transfer, each seed in the soil, Daniel felt something new stirring inside him. Hope. Not fragile this time, but rooted. Winter faded into spring, and Daniel Carter's life looked different in small but powerful ways. His debts had shrunk. His emergency fund stood firm. And each month, a tiny trickle of money flowed into an index fund, growing slowly but steadily. For the first time in years, Daniel's shoulders didn't slump under the weight of bills. His chest didn't tighten each time the mail arrived. There was breathing room. And with breathing room came temptation. It started innocently enough. One Saturday morning, Daniel passed a storefront downtown. Sleek glass, neon lights framing the latest smartphones. He paused, staring at the display. His own phone was 5 years old, its cracked screen covered with a cheap plastic film, its battery barely holding a charge. He told himself it worked fine, but standing there, looking at the new models, smooth, glossy, alive with color, he felt the itch. "You've earned it," a voice inside whispered. "You've sacrificed for months. What's one upgrade?" He shook his head, forcing himself to walk away. But the image lingered. That week, the whispers grew louder. At work, co-workers joked about Daniel's beat-up car in the parking lot. "Thing's a dinosaur, man." One of them laughed. "When you going to treat yourself to something with Bluetooth?" Daniel laughed along, but inside, the words festered. He imagined sliding into a new car, the smell of fresh upholstery, the gleam of clean paint. He imagined Mia's eyes lighting up when he drove her in something shiny. "You deserve it," the voice whispered again. One evening, the temptation nearly won. Daniel sat at his table, scrolling through a website, building a customized car with features he'd never dreamed of before. Heated seats, a touchscreen dashboard, metallic blue paint. The monthly payment glowed on the screen, $389. It was almost affordable. Almost. He leaned back, heart racing. He could do it. His debts were shrinking, his savings growing. Why not enjoy life a little? Then his gaze fell on his notebook, open beside the laptop. The words stared back at him. Debt is chains. Savings is armor. Investing is wings. He closed the laptop slowly, exhaling hard. "No," he whispered to himself. "Not yet." The struggle gnawed at him for weeks. It wasn't just about stuff. It was about identity. For years, Daniel had been the broke guy, the one always scraping by, always saying no. Now, for the first time, he wasn't drowning. He wanted to feel like he belonged in the world of abundance, not just survival. But abundance, he reminded himself, wasn't the same as indulgence. One night, Javier gave him the words he needed. They were eating lunch on the dock when Daniel confessed, "Sometimes I feel like I'm punishing myself. Everyone else has nice things. I keep saying no, but for what?" Javier nodded, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "It's not about saying no forever. It's about saying yes on your terms. You think freedom is buying stuff. But real freedom is choosing, not being forced by debt, not being pressured by others. Choosing." The word echoed in Daniel's chest. Choosing. He thought of the new phone, the car, the gadgets. Did he truly choose them? Or were they choices made for him by ads, by coworkers, by the itch of comparison? The difference was everything. With that shift, Daniel began experimenting. Instead of banning himself from every pleasure, he created a new system, the joy envelope. Each month, he set aside a small amount, $20, maybe $30, strictly for something fun. A coffee at a nice cafe, a used book from the shop downtown, ice cream with Mia on a hot afternoon. The purchases were tiny, almost laughable compared to the temptations he'd resisted. But they carried no guilt, no shame. They were chosen, planned, controlled. And to his surprise, they satisfied him more than any gadget ever had. The real turning point came on a Saturday in May. Daniel had been invited to a co-worker's barbecue. In the past, he would have dreaded it, watching others laugh, drink, show off their new clothes or cars. But this time, he arrived with a bowl of homemade pasta salad, a smile, and a calm he hadn't felt in years. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to money. One man bragged about his new truck, another about a vacation he'd charged to his card. The group laughed, but Daniel noticed the tightness in their eyes, the way the stories always ended with, "I'll pay it off eventually." For once, Daniel didn't feel envy. He felt free. He wasn't driving a new car or scrolling a shiny phone. But his debts were shrinking, his savings growing, his investments multiplying quietly in the background. He didn't know anyone. And that, he realized, was wealth of a different kind. That night, walking home under the stars, Daniel whispered to himself, "I don't need more. I need enough. And I'm getting there." The temptation hadn't vanished. It never would. But for the first time, Daniel felt stronger than the whisper. Daniel's life didn't suddenly become glamorous. His car still groaned. His phone still cracked. But his soul was lighter, his choices firmer. He learned that temptation wasn't the enemy. Mindless spending was. And by creating space for small joys, he found balance. Freedom wasn't about buying more. It was about choosing wisely, choosing freely, choosing enough. And that, he realized, was the richest choice of all. The rhythm of Daniel Carter's life had finally begun to steady. Each morning, he woke before dawn, laced his scuffed sneakers, and walked to the warehouse with his lunch packed carefully in a faded blue bag. He worked his shift, clocked overtime when it came, then trudged home in the dim afterglow of sunset. Evenings were quiet, a notebook spread open, a simple dinner simmering on the stove, a cup of coffee cooling on the table beside him. It wasn't glamorous, but it was working. The snowball kept shrinking. The emergency fund sat untouched, $1,000 in crisp bills locked in a fireproof box under his bed. His tiny investment account ticked upward, dollar by dollar. And though temptation still whispered, Daniel was learning to answer with discipline, with patience, with a kind of calm he'd never known before. Life was fragile, yes, but it felt stable. Until the storm came. It started with a cough, a dry, rasping tickle in his throat that lingered for days, then weeks. Daniel brushed it off at first, fatigue from long shifts, maybe the dust in the warehouse. But by mid-March, the cough grew harsher. His chest tightened with each breath, his body heavy with exhaustion. "Go see a doctor," his sister urged over the phone. "I can't afford it right now," Daniel muttered. But deep down, he knew the truth. He couldn't afford not to. The clinic visit was quick, but sobering. Bronchitis, the doctor said, scribbling notes. Rest, fluids, and antibiotics. You'll need at least a week off work. Daniel's heart sank. A week without payment, a gap in rent, in bills, in everything. And the prescription itself wasn't free. At the pharmacy counter, the total blinked back at him. $137. He stared at the number, the old panic surging, the panic of not having enough. His hand twitched toward his pocket, where his old credit card still lurked, its magnetic stripe worn from years of overuse. But then he remembered. The fireproof box. The envelope inside. The cash he'd fought so hard to build. Slowly, almost reverently, he pulled out his debit card, linked to a checking account padded by the emergency fund. He handed it to the cashier. Swipe. Approved. And for the first time in his adult life, an unexpected bill didn't break him. The relief was overwhelming. That night, coughing between spoonfuls of broth, Daniel sat at his kitchen table and wept. Not from sickness, but from gratitude. The storm had hit, just as he'd feared. But this time he hadn't drowned. The emergency fund had done its job. Still, fear lingered. With no paycheck for a week, expenses loomed large. Rent, utilities, food. The old familiar dread crept in. What if the fund drained too fast? What if another bill came? What if this was just the beginning? His chest ached, not from bronchitis, but from the weight of those what-ifs. In his fever haze, Daniel dreamed of his past self, the man who would have swiped a card without hesitation, who would have spiraled deeper into debt over $137, who would have told himself, "I'll pay it off eventually." But that man was gone. Now, lying in his bed, Daniel repeated a mantra between coughs. This is why you saved. This is why you prepared. After 3 restless days, Javier called. "Heard you're out sick," the older man said, his voice warm but firm. "Don't be stubborn, Carter. Use your savings. That's what they're for." "I already did," Daniel admitted. "Paid for the meds without touching a card." There was silence on the line, then a low chuckle. "That's the first time you've said that, isn't it? You sound proud." I am," Daniel whispered. "Good," Javier said. "Remember, money's not just numbers. It's peace. And you've earned some." The week crawled by in a blur of coughing fits, endless tea, and stacks of library books he'd neglected for years. His sister dropped off groceries. Mia drew him a "get well soon" card covered in bright crayon hearts. By Friday, the fever broke. And though his body still ached, Daniel felt something stronger inside. Resilience. He had spent $137. He had lost a week of pay, but he hadn't lost control. The fund had dipped, yes, but not vanished. His debts hadn't grown. His snowball hadn't shattered. The storm had tested him, and he'd stood firm. When he finally returned to the warehouse, co-workers clapped him on the back, joking about how the place nearly fell apart without you. Daniel smiled, but inside, he carried something heavier, a lesson carved deep by fire. Emergencies weren't punishments. They were inevitabilities. And without armor, they destroyed you. With armor, they only slowed you down. That night, Daniel opened his notebook and wrote across a fresh page. The emergency fund saved me. Build it stronger. Always. Over the next month, he rebuilt. Every overtime shift, every side hustle dollar, every trimmed expense, he funneled them back in a fireproof box. By April, the envelope was full again. By May, it was fatter than before, creeping toward $1,500. The experience had changed him. Before, saving had felt abstract, distant. Now, it was visceral, tangible. Each bill in the envelope wasn't just paper. It was antibiotics. It was groceries. It was rent. It was survival without debt. And that, Daniel realized, was freedom. Daniel's body healed, but more importantly, his trust in himself grew stronger. He had faced a storm that once would have crushed him, and walked through it scarred but unbroken. The emergency fund wasn't just money in a box. It was proof. Proof that he could protect himself. Proof that he could trust the systems he was building. Proof that he was no longer at the mercy of chance. For the first time, Daniel didn't just believe in financial freedom. He believed in his own ability to reach it. The warehouse floor hummed with its usual chaos. The rattle of forklifts, the shouts of foremen, the steady clatter of boxes shuffled from pallet to pallet. Daniel Carter wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, his muscles aching from another double shift. The grind had become routine. Long hours, short nights, and a steady march of paychecks funneling into bills, envelopes, and now investments. But as Daniel stacked another box onto the growing tower, his thoughts weren't on the work in front of him. They were on a number. $2,476.13. The balance of his last credit card. The final chain. It sat like a shadow in his mind, heavy and persistent. Every other debt, the store card, the personal loan, the smaller balances, had been defeated one by one. Each victory had tasted sweet, a spark of pride he hadn't known he was capable of. But this one was different. It was the first, the oldest, the one that had trapped him in the cycle. He remembered the day he signed up for it. Years ago, a folding table in the mall, a smiling representative handing out free t-shirts. "You'll build credit," she'd said, her voice cheerful. "It's just a tool. Use it wisely." Daniel had been 22, broke and restless, working odd jobs and desperate for independence. The idea of instant purchasing power had dazzled him. No waiting, no saving, just swipe and own. That first swipe had been a pair of sneakers he couldn't afford. Then dinners out. Then electronics. Then bar tabs. Each swipe a thrill, each statement a slap. And slowly, the balance grew. $300, $800, $1,500, climbing higher as interest piled on. He had promised himself he would pay it down soon, but soon never came. The minimum payment became a leash, dragging him month after month. Now, years later, the balance had shrunk to a final figure. $2,476.13. A monster cornered, but still alive. In the evenings, Daniel would sit at his kitchen table, notebook open, numbers sprawled across the page. $300 this paycheck, he'd mutter, scribbling down the payment plan. $200 from overtime. $50 from a jacket I sold online. He watched the balance shrink like water draining from a cracked jug. Slowly, agonizingly, the numbers fell. $1,900. $1,400. $900. Each payment was a battle, a trade-off between present comfort and future freedom. He skipped nights out, said no to invitations, ate meals of beans and rice until he could cook them in his sleep. Every sacrifice was measured against the vision of that balance hitting zero. And every time the temptation to quit rose, every time the whisper said, "You've done enough, you deserve a break," Daniel forced himself to remember the weight of his past. The shame of watching his paycheck vanish before he even touched it. The fear of collection calls. The anger at himself for being trapped. He wasn't just paying off money. He He was reclaiming years of his life. One night, exhausted after work, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the fireproof box under his frame. Inside was his emergency fund, solid and untouchable. Next to it lay a small stack of old statements he had saved from his darkest days. He pulled one out, smoothing the crumpled paper. The bold letters screamed across the top, "Past due." His younger self had stared at those words with dread, his stomach twisted, his heart pounding. Each envelope felt like a verdict. Daniel closed his eyes, breathing deeply. "Not anymore," he whispered. "Not ever again." By July, the balance was down to $640. The end was so close he could taste it. But the smaller the number grew, the louder the temptation screamed. "You've almost won. Why not ease up?" The whispers followed him everywhere. In the break room, where coworkers unwrapped takeout burgers. At the store, where new shoes gleamed from display racks. Online, where ads promised luxury you deserve. One evening, his sister called. "Daniel, we're going to Lake this weekend. You should come. It'll be good for Mia to see you." He wanted to say yes. He wanted the sun, the laughter, the smell of barbecue drifting across the water. But he also knew the trip would mean gas, snacks, maybe a new swimsuit. $50 at least. And $50 was a chunk of freedom. So he swallowed the lump in his throat and said softly, "Not this time. Soon. I promise." When he hung up, guilt gnawed at him. But beneath it, pride simmered too. He wasn't denying joy. He was choosing freedom. Finally, the day came. August 14th. Daniel's paycheck had cleared. His notebook calculations had lined up perfectly. The balance, $212.08. The last number. He sat at his table that evening, the room quiet except for the hum of his old refrigerator. His laptop glowed in front of him, the payment portal open. His debit card rested in his palm, warm from his grip. His hand shook. It wasn't logical. It was just a payment, just numbers on a screen. But to Daniel, it was everything. He typed slowly, deliberately, $212.08. His finger hovered over the button. Memories surged, his first swipe, his first missed payment, his father's voice mocking debt collectors on the answering machine, his own shame when friends covered his tabs. And then, with a deep breath, he clicked. Payment submitted. Balance, $0. Silence. The screen glowed, the confirmation bold and undeniable. 0. For a moment, Daniel didn't move. He just stared, his chest rising and falling, his mind unable to process it. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, hands covering his face. Tears slid hot down his cheeks. Years of chains. Years of weight. Years of shame. Gone. The tears turned to laughter, choked and messy. He stumbled to his feet, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair. "I did it," he whispered, then louder. "I did it." His voice echoed off the bare walls. That night, he didn't cook dinner. He didn't turn on the TV. He just sat in the quiet glow of victory, notebook open, writing across the page in bold letters. Debt-free. At last. The next morning, Daniel dug through his desk drawer until he found the card itself. Chipped, bent, its embossed numbers faded from years of use. He held it in his hand, feeling its weight, its history. This little piece of plastic had ruled him. It had whispered promises and delivered chains. Not anymore. He grabbed a pair of scissors. The snip was sharp, final. He cut the card in half, then in quarters, the pieces falling into the trash. A shiver ran through him. Not fear, but release. The chain was broken. Later that evening, he called his sister. "I'm coming to the lake this weekend," he said, smiling into the phone. Her laugh was pure joy. "Mia will be so excited." What changed? Daniel glanced at the trash can, the shredded card resting among scraps of paper. "Everything," he said softly. Everything changed. Daniel Carter was debt-free. The road ahead was still long. Savings to build, investments to grow, a future to design. But the ghosts of the past no longer haunted him. The weight no longer pressed on his chest. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel was free not just to survive, but to build. And as he sat on his balcony that night, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon, he whispered a promise to himself. Never again. Only forward. The first morning after becoming debt-free felt strange. Daniel Carter woke to the same faint sunlight filtering through his cheap blinds, The same groan of the radiator rattling in the corner. The same quiet hum of the neighborhood outside. Yet something was different. The weight on his chest, the one that had lived there for over a decade, was gone. He lay still, staring at the ceiling, his body unsure of how to exist without the familiar dread of debt pressing against him. For years, debt had been the drumbeat of his life. Every paycheck measured against balances. Every decision weighed against interest rates. Every future plan shadowed by the question, how will you pay for it? Now, the question had shifted. What comes next? That day at work, the warehouse felt louder than usual, forklifts shrieking, pallets slamming into concrete. Daniel moved through it in a daze, the thought circling his mind like a hawk. Debt-free, debt-free. He wanted to shout it, to tell everyone. But the words felt private, sacred, like a secret victory. Instead, he kept his head down, working through the motions. Yet each time his mind drifted, he saw it again. The confirmation screen glowing with $0, the cut pieces of plastic in his trash. Chains cut, at last. But the victory carried unease, too. For so long, Daniel's life had been defined by the fight against debt. His purpose was clear: pay it down, dollar by dollar. Each sacrifice had meaning. Each decision was weighed against the mission. Now that the enemy was gone, he felt adrift. What did it mean to live without chains? That evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, notebook open to a fresh page. He wrote in block letters across the top, "Life after debt." Below, he wrote questions. How do I live without swiping a card? What if an emergency comes? What goals replace pay down? Who am I without debt? The questions scared him more than the debt ever had. Debt was heavy, but it was familiar. Freedom was light, but it was unknown. The first test came quickly. 2 weeks later, Daniel was grocery shopping when he spotted a display of televisions at the end of an aisle. Flat screens, massive and sleek, their colors so vivid they looked alive. His own TV at home was a bulky relic, its picture washed out, its speakers crackling. He dreamed of replacing it for years. And now, with no debt dragging him down, the thought hit him like a jolt. You could buy one, right now. For a moment, he stood frozen, his pulse quickening. The old itch returned, the old voice whispering, "Swipe the card. Bring it home. You deserve it." But then the whisper fell silent. Because there was no card. Not anymore. Daniel walked slowly past the display, his reflection flashing in the glossy screens. He felt a mix of longing and pride. He could have bought one, but he didn't need to. Instead, he filled his cart with rice, beans, vegetables, and chicken, the meals that had carried him through the storm. When he reached the checkout, he paid with his debit card, the total pulled directly from money he already owned. No tricks, no illusions, just reality. It felt clean, yet the temptation lingered, not just in stores, but in conversations. At lunch one day, his coworkers talked about credit cards with points and perks. "You're crazy not to use them," one man laughed, pulling out a glossy rewards card. "I'm flying to Vegas next month for free." Daniel chewed his sandwich quietly, remembering the shredded plastic in his trash. "Don't you have one, Carter?" another coworker asked. "Not anymore," Daniel said simply. They looked at him with a mix of pity and disbelief, as if he'd given up oxygen itself. But inside, Daniel felt steady. He wasn't missing out. He was free. One evening, Daniel called Javier, pacing his living room as the words tumbled out. "It feels strange," he admitted. "For years, the fight was all I knew. Now that it's over, I don't know what to aim for. I feel like I've built a house with no furniture. Solid but empty." Javier chuckled softly on the other end. "That's the beauty, Carter. Debt-free isn't the finish line. It's the foundation. Now you get to build the life you actually want. But you've got to decide what that is." Daniel stopped pacing, the words hitting him with weight. Build the life you want. Not the life dictated by minimum payments. Not the life pressured by creditors. Not the life of survival. His life. His choice. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Daniel began to craft new habits. Every payday, instead of sending chunks to creditors, he divided his money into envelopes and accounts. Bills, savings, investing, the tiny joy envelope for small pleasures. For the first time, the math felt like building, not bailing water from a sinking ship. He tracked every dollar, not with panic, but with curiosity. Where could he direct it? What seed could it plant? He started imagining goals beyond survival. A fully funded emergency fund, a down payment for a future home, maybe even travel. Real travel. Not the reckless kind charged to a card, but intentional, chosen, earned. The vision was blurry, but it was his. One Saturday, his sister invited him over for dinner. As they sat at the table, Mia chattered about school, waving her arms excitedly. His sister smiled at Daniel. "You seem different lately," she said. "How so?" "Lighter. Like you're not carrying the same burden." Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "I'm not. I'm debt-free." Her eyes widened. "Daniel, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you." Mia tilted her head. "What's debt-free mean?" Daniel looked at her, his voice soft. "It means Uncle Daniel doesn't owe anyone anymore. My money is my own now." Mia grinned. "So you're rich." He laughed, shaking his head. "Not yet, but I'm free. And that's better." That night, driving home, Daniel thought about Mia's question. Rich. He didn't care about riches. He cared about choice. About never again feeling trapped. Never again drowning in interest and shame. Freedom wasn't measured in millions. It was measured in control. And for the first time, he had it. Life after debt was not easy. It was uncharted, uncertain, full of temptations and questions. But Daniel was no longer fighting to escape the past. He was shaping the future. Each day, each decision, each dollar carried new meaning. He had cut the chains. Now, he was learning how to walk without them. And as he closed his notebook that night, he wrote across the page, "Debt-free is not the end. It's the beginning." The excitement of being debt-free lasted weeks. Daniel Carter carried it like a secret flame, glowing in his chest. Every morning he woke lighter. Every night he slept deeper. For the first time in over a decade, his paycheck belonged entirely to him. But freedom carried its own quiet weight. Without the chains of debt, there was no enemy to fight, no finish line to chase. The battles were over. Now came the siege, the slow, deliberate work of building defenses strong enough to withstand whatever storms life might send next. And that, Daniel realized, was harder in its own way. One Friday evening, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, notebook open, pen tapping against the margin. He had listed his monthly expenses, rent, utilities, food, transportation, and multiplied them by 3, then by 6. The numbers stared back at him. 3 months of expenses, $7,200. 6 months, $14,400. His emergency fund currently stood at $1,500. The gap stretched like a canyon. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Paying off debt had been hard, yes, but every payment came with instant feedback. The balance dropped, the chains loosened. Progress was visible, tangible. Saving, on the other hand, felt like pouring water into a well and waiting to see it rise. Patience was the new battlefield. The first month, he managed to save $500. He tucked it into his high-yield savings account, watching the numbers climb to $2,000. But when he checked again a week later, the balance hadn't changed. The growth was invisible, a drop compared to the mountain he needed. The temptation returned. What if I used this money for something else? Something fun, something visible. A trip, a TV, a new car. The whispers were dangerous. Without debt to restrain him, without creditors breathing down his neck, the urge to spend returned in new disguises. Daniel closed his laptop with a snap, pushing the thought away. "Not this time," he muttered. "This money has a job." At the warehouse, the summer heat pressed down like a weight. Sweat soaked his shirt as he hauled boxes, his muscles aching. Coworkers joked about vacations, about cruises, about splurges. "You should come, Carter," one man laughed. "Live a little." Daniel forced a smile, but inside, the words echoed. Live a little. Was he living, or just denying himself endlessly? That night, he called Javier. "Saving feels empty," Daniel admitted. "Like I'm just sitting here, watching numbers on a screen. No excitement, no reward. I thought freedom would feel better." On the other end of the line, Javier chuckled. "You've been living in survival mode for so long, Carter. You got used to the adrenaline. Debt gave you drama. But wealth? Wealth is quiet. It doesn't shout. It whispers security. Daniel frowned. Whispers don't motivate me. Then change how you listen, Javier said. Don't think of saving as denying yourself. Think of it as building a fortress. Every dollar is another brick. One day, when the storm comes, that fortress will stand between you and ruin. Daniel let the words sink in. A fortress. Bricks. Protection. For the first time, saving didn't feel passive. It felt like construction. From then on, Daniel began to picture each deposit not as money lost, but as a wall rising higher, thicker, stronger. When his car needed new brakes, he paid cash, and the fortress held. When his rent crept up by $50, the fortress absorbed the blow. He began automating his savings. $250 each paycheck funneled directly into his emergency account before he could even touch it. It was quiet, invisible but steady. The fortress was rising, brick by brick. One Saturday morning, his sister invited him over again. The smell of pancakes filled the kitchen as Mia ran around the table, giggling. You're different, his sister said, pouring coffee. Calmer. Like you're not waiting for the next disaster. Daniel smiled faintly. That's the point. I'm building a safety net. An emergency fund. His sister nodded slowly. I've never had one. Feels like there's always something urgent before I can save. Daniel looked at her, his voice quiet but firm. That's what I used to say. But the emergencies don't stop just because you're unprepared. They just hit harder. Saving doesn't stop life from happening. It just makes life survivable. She was silent for a long moment, then said softly, Maybe I should start. Daniel smiled. For the first time, he felt like a teacher, not just a struggler. The months stretched on. Summer gave way to fall, the air cooling, leaves drifting across the warehouse parking lot. Daniel worked overtime shifts, sold old clothes online, cooked every meal at home. The fortress grew. $3,000, $4,200, $5,000. When the balance crossed $5,000, Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. His throat tightened, his chest heavy with emotion. He had never seen a number like that in his account before. Not without owing it to someone else. Not without a due date looming above it. This was his. Untouched. Waiting. He closed his eyes, imagining a storm pounding against the walls of his life. A job loss, an illness, a broken car. And for the first time, he felt no fear. The fortress would hold. That night, Daniel pulled out his old notebook, flipping through the pages filled with debts and balances, scribbled calculations, desperate plans. He stopped at the page marked in bold. The emergency fund saved me. Build it stronger. Always. He traced the words with his finger, then wrote beneath them. $5,000 saved. Fortress rising. Saving wasn't glamorous. It wasn't thrilling, but it was powerful. Each dollar Daniel saved was a declaration. I am no longer at the mercy of chance. The fortress was not yet complete. Storms would still come. But with every brick, every sacrifice, every quiet deposit, Daniel was building something stronger than debt, stronger than fear. He was building freedom that would last. And as he looked at the growing balance, he realized something profound. The fight against debt had taught him discipline, but the act of saving was teaching him patience. And patience, he understood now, was the true key to freedom. The leaves had begun to turn, splashes of orange and red drifting across the streets as autumn settled in. Daniel Carter walked home from the warehouse one evening, his breath visible in the cooling air, the weight of his lunch pail swinging in his hand. Inside his apartment, he dropped the pail onto the counter, kicked off his boots, and sat heavily at the table. His laptop blinked awake under his fingers, the glow filling the dim room. He navigated to his bank account, staring at the balance. $6,200. The emergency fund was growing. Brick by brick, his fortress stood taller. But as he stared at the number, he felt something unexpected. Restlessness. It was safe, yes. Secure. But wasn't moving. For years, Daniel's life had been about survival. Every dollar earned was spent plugging holes, bailing water, patching leaks. Now the boat was steady. For the first time, he wasn't sinking, and he began to wonder, what if the money could row too? That night, unable to sleep, Daniel turned on a podcast Javier had recommended. A calm voice spoke through his earbuds, explaining the basics of compound interest. Imagine you plant a single seed, the voice said. With time, water, and sunlight, that seed grows into a tree. That tree drops more seeds, which grow into more trees. Over years, what began as one seed becomes a forest. That's how investing works. Your money grows not just by what you add, but by what it earns on its own. Daniel lay in the dark, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the words echoing. A forest from a single seed. He thought of his own life. Years of labor, sweat, double shifts, aching muscles. Money had only come when he fought for it, bled for it. The idea that money could work for him, quietly, in the background, was almost unbelievable. But it was possible, if he dared to try. The next weekend, Daniel sat with Javier at a small coffee shop, steam rising from their cups. Javier leaned back in his chair, smiling knowingly. "You're ready," he said. "Ready for what?" "To stop playing defense all the time. To start playing offense." Daniel frowned. "You mean investing?" Javier nodded. "You've built your fortress. Now it's time to plant your orchard inside. Cash keeps you safe. Investments make you grow." Daniel shook his head slowly. "I don't know, man. The stock market, it feels like gambling. I don't know the rules. I don't want to lose everything." Javier's smile softened. "That's fear talking, and I get it. But gambling is when you don't know the odds. Investing is when you learn the rules. And the first rule is simple: time. You let your money sit and grow. The market goes up and down, but over years, it climbs. Always has." Daniel sipped his coffee, the bitterness grounding him. "And what if it doesn't? Then you'll still have your fortress. But what if it does? What if you give your future self the gift of freedom years earlier?" The words sank deep. Freedom. Earlier. That night, Daniel searched online, reading articles, watching videos, try to untangle the language of investing. Index funds, ETFs, dividends, compounding. It was overwhelming at first, a maze of jargon and numbers. But slowly, patterns emerged. He learned that most millionaires weren't gamblers or geniuses. They were ordinary people who invested consistently, patiently, letting time do the work. One article showed a chart, the S&P 500 over decades, climbing relentlessly despite crashes and recessions. The line rose like a mountain, jagged but undeniable. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding. The forest. The fear didn't disappear overnight. It lingered in the quiet moments, whispering doubts. What if you lose it all? What if this is another trap? But another voice, quieter but stronger, began to answer. What if this is the way out? What if this is how you stop trading your life for money? The following Friday, Daniel sat at his table with his laptop, open to a brokerage website. His palms were slick, his throat tight. He had created the account days earlier, filling in forms, linking his bank. Now the page blinked back at him, empty, waiting. Deposit funds, it read. Daniel swallowed hard. He typed, $500. The number looked small compared to his savings, but to him it felt enormous. This wasn't just money. It was trust. He clicked submit. The transfer processed. Funds available, $500. His chest tightened. Then came a harder part, choosing where to place it. He scrolled past endless tickers, names, numbers flashing red and green. His head spun, but then he remembered Javier's advice. Don't try to beat the market. Just buy the market. Own the whole forest. Daniel typed, VO, an index fund tracking the S&P 500. Price, $387 per share. He clicked buy. Quantity, 1. Funds used, $387. Order submitted. Order filled. On his screen, a new line appeared. Holdings, 1 share VO. Daniel sat frozen, staring at the words. He had just become an investor. The world outside hadn't changed. The radiator still hissed. The blinds still rattled. Cars still passed on the street below. But inside, everything was different. Daniel Carter was no longer just a man who worked for money. He was a man whose money now worked for him. Over the weeks that followed, he checked the account obsessively. Some days, the value dipped by a few dollars. His stomach dropped each time. But then, other days it rose. $1, $5, $10. At first, the swings felt like earthquakes. But gradually, he began to see them for what they were, ripples in a vast ocean. He added another $200, then another $300. Each time, the account grew. Slowly, steadily, the forest was forming. One evening, Daniel met his sister for dinner. As Mia doodled on a napkin, his sister leaned across the table. "You seem different again," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm investing now." Her eyes widened. "Really? Isn't that risky?" He nodded slowly. "So is working until you're 70 with nothing saved. I've spent too long chained to the past. Now I'm planting for the future." His sister studied him, then smiled. "I never thought I'd hear you say something like that." Daniel looked down at Mia, her pen scratching across the paper. "Neither did I." That night, back at his apartment, Daniel opened his account again. The numbers were small, barely more than $1,000 invested. But to him, they were monumental. Because it wasn't about the amount. It was about the direction. He had turned the page. The fortress was strong. But now, inside its walls, Daniel had planted the first seeds of tomorrow. The forest was invisible, just a sapling in the soil of his future. But it would grow, quietly, steadily, powerfully. And as Daniel lay in bed that night, drifting to sleep, he whispered to himself, "I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm building." At first, Daniel Carter checked his investment account like a man in love. Each morning before work, he sat at the kitchen table with coffee steaming beside him, laptop open, eyes fixed on the numbers. Some days they were up, a few dollars higher than the day before. Those mornings, he walked to the warehouse with a bounce in his step, shoulders lighter, hope swelling in his chest. Other days, they dipped. $2 down. 5. 10. He felt it like a weight in his stomach, a tightening in his chest. But overall, the line crept upward, and Daniel told himself this was progress. Slow, steady progress. Until November. It began with a headline. Market slides on economic fears. Daniel frowned at the words, scrolling through article after article. He didn't understand all the jargon, but the meaning was clear. Stocks were falling. He opened his account. Balance, $1,175. Down $60 from the day before. He told himself it was nothing. A small dip. The market moved like this. Javier had said so. But the next day, it was down another $80. And the next, $120. By the end of the week, Daniel's account balance showed $950. He stared at the red numbers glowing on his screen, his throat dry. He had lost over $200. Gone. Just like that. The old panic returned, sharp and familiar. The same fear that had haunted him when bills piled up, when credit cards maxed out, when collection calls echoed through his phone. What if I lose it all? His hands trembled on the keyboard. He hovered over the sell button, the urge screaming in his mind, "Get out before it's too late." But another voice whispered, quieter, "Stay the course." Daniel slammed the laptop shut, unable to look anymore. That night, he lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding. The fortress he had built, the seeds he had planted, was it all crumbling already? Had he been a fool to trust this system, this invisible market that rose and fell like the tide? He thought of every overtime shift, every meal of rice and beans, every sacrifice that had built that money. To see it vanish in red numbers felt like a knife twisting in his gut. The next morning, Daniel called Javier. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I can't do this. The market's crashing. I'm losing money. I worked too hard to watch it disappear." On the other end, Javier's voice was calm, steady. "Breathe, Carter. Tell me, what did you buy?" "An index fund." "Voo. Just like you said." "And why?" "Because it grows long-term. Because time makes it climb." Javier's tone sharpened slightly. "So what's changed?" Daniel hesitated. It's dropping." "Exactly. That's not a change. That's normal. The only thing that's changed is your fear." Daniel was silent, gripping the phone tight. Javier continued. "You're looking at the forest through a magnifying glass, Carter. Of course it looks jagged up close. But step back, the forest grows. Always has. Always will." Daniel swallowed hard. "But what if this time is different?" "It won't be." "You know why?" "Because people don't stop living. They don't stop working, building, buying. The world keeps moving. And when it does, the market rises again. Your job isn't to predict the storm. Your job is to plant through it." The words echoed in Daniel's mind long after the call ended. Plant through the storm. But fear lingered. For days, he avoided opening his account, too afraid to see more red. Each time he thought of it, his chest tightened. Finally, one Saturday, he forced himself to look. Balance, $875. Lower than ever. His stomach dropped. But then he noticed something else. Shares owned, 3. The number was higher than he remembered. Somewhere along the way, dividends had reinvested, automatically buying him more. Even in the storm, the forest was still planting seeds. That night, Daniel pulled out his notebook. He flipped past old pages of debt, of budgets, of savings goals. On a fresh sheet, he wrote, "The market is not my enemy. Fear is." He stared at the words, the truth sinking in. The red numbers weren't losses unless he sold. They were only shadows, temporary dips on a mountain that still climbed. And if he could hold steady, if he could plant through the storm, the forest would grow taller than he could ever imagine. The next paycheck, Daniel did something that terrified him. He invested anyway. Another $250. Straight into VO. His finger hovered over the button, sweat slicking his palm. Then he clicked. Order submitted. Order filled. And just like that, he had chosen faith over fear. Weeks turned to months. Winter wrapped the city in ice, snow crunching under Daniel's boots as he trudged to the warehouse each morning. The market continued to slide, his account dipping lower, then stabilizing, then dipping again. But Daniel no longer panicked. Each time he contributed, he imagined himself planting seeds in the frozen ground, seeds that would one day break through the soil, green and unstoppable. One evening in January, he met his sister for coffee. She asked how his investments were doing. Daniel smiled faintly. Down, but that's okay. She frowned. How is that okay? Because I'm buying more while it's cheap. Someday it won't be, and I'll be glad I planted in the storm. She studied him, then laughed softly. You really are different now. Daniel sipped his coffee, the warmth spreading through him. Different, yes. Stronger, patient, steadier. By spring, the market began to climb again. Slowly, the red turned green. Daniel's account balance rose past $1,200, then $1,500. But this time, he didn't celebrate the green any more than he'd fear the red. Because he understood now. The numbers would rise and fall, just as seasons changed, storms came and went. The forest wasn't built in a day. It grew in decades. And Daniel Carter was in it for the long haul. The storm had tested him, shaking the foundations of his newfound courage. But he had not run. He had not sold. He had planted through the storm. And in that choice, Daniel learned the most powerful lesson of all. Wealth is not built by avoiding storms. It is built by standing firm through them. The warehouse buzzed with the clatter of forklifts and the steady rhythm of boxes sliding along the conveyor belt. Daniel Carter wiped sweat from his forehead, his muscles aching with the familiar grind. 12 years on this floor, and the sounds had never changed. The whir of machinery, the beep of scanners, the grunts of men trading their strength for dollars. But now, something inside him was shifting. He had tasted freedom. The fortress of savings stood tall. His investments were sprouting, fragile but alive. Still, the future loomed long and heavy. Decades more of this work. Decades more of aching bones, of living by the clock, of trading days for wages. The thought tightened his chest. Is this all there is? That evening, Daniel sat on the couch, dinner plate balanced on his lap, flipping through YouTube. One thumbnail caught his eye. A man smiling broadly, standing in front of a whiteboard filled with numbers. The title read, Coast Fire, Retire Early Without Saving Forever. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Coast Fire. He clicked. The man explained in energetic tones. Most people think they have to save aggressively until they're 65. But what if you could save hard for just 10 to 15 years, then stop? What if you could let your investments grow on autopilot and still retire comfortably? That's Coast Fire. Build a big enough nest egg early, and you can coast the rest of the way. Daniel froze, fork halfway to his mouth. Coast. The word echoed in his mind. Could be that simple. The next morning, he brought it up with Javier over coffee. Coast Fire. Daniel asked skeptically. Sounds like another gimmick. Get rich quick. Javier chuckled. Not quick, Carter. That's the point. It's get rich slow, then stop pushing so hard. Coast Fire means you save and invest enough early that compound interest does the heavy lifting. After that, you don't have to keep adding much. You can just coast. Daniel frowned. But I'm not some tech bro making six figures. I got a warehouse job. How can I coast? Javier leaned forward, eyes steady. You underestimate yourself. You're already investing. You're already building. Coast Fire isn't about getting rich overnight. It's about giving future Daniel the chance to stop running the race. That night, Daniel sat with his notebook, scribbling numbers. He calculated his current savings rate, his investments, his expenses. The math was messy, the projections confusing, but one thing became clear. If he kept planting steadily, if he gave the seeds time, there would come a point where his future no longer depended on endless grinding. He could stop adding, stop chasing. He could breathe. The forest would grow on its own. But disbelief gnawed at him. He remembered his 20s, drowning in credit cards, buying pizza on borrowed money, sinking deeper with each swipe. That man had never dreamed of retirement, let alone freedom. Could he truly rewrite the script? He opened his laptop, running calculators online. If he invested $500 a month for 10 years, by age 44 he could have nearly $100,000. Left untouched, by 65 it could grow to $500,000. $500,000. Daniel leaned back, heart pounding. Not billionaire wealth, not yachts or mansions, but enough. Enough to live simply, securely. Enough to never fear the phone ringing with collectors again. The thought sent a chill down his spine. One Saturday, his sister visited with Mia. As they sat in the kitchen, Daniel explained Coast Fire, sketching stick figures and arrows on a notepad. So you're saying, his sister said slowly, that if you save and invest enough now, you can stop later? Daniel nodded. Exactly. The money will grow even if I don't add much. It's like pushing a boulder up a hill. Once you reach the top, gravity takes over. She laughed softly. Sounds too good to be true. Daniel smiled. That's what I thought. But the math checks out. It's not about being rich. It's about being consistent. Mia peeked over the table at his drawings. Uncle Danny, are you going to be rich? He chuckled, ruffling her hair. Not rich, kiddo. Free. The word stuck with him. Free. For years, Daniel had thought freedom meant escaping debt, paying bills on time, silencing the collectors. But this was a different kind of freedom. Not just running from chains, but running toward open horizons. It wasn't about money for money's sake. It was about choice. About mornings without alarm clocks, afternoons spent hiking trails instead of lifting boxes, evenings spent with family instead of collapsing in exhaustion. And for the first time, Daniel began to believe it was possible. The following weeks were filled with late nights of research. He read blogs, watched videos, listened to podcasts. He learned about withdrawal rates, index funds, and inflation adjustments. The numbers were dizzying, but beneath them lay a simple truth. Time was the most powerful currency, and he had started early enough to let it work. One evening, Daniel stood at his apartment window, watching snowflakes drift under the streetlights. His reflection stared back, a man older than his years, lines etched by worry, shoulders hardened by labor. But beneath the weariness, something new glimmered. Hope. The path stretched long ahead. Decades of work still loomed. But now, Daniel carried a map, a vision of a future not chained to endless labor. Coast Fire was not a fantasy. It was a possibility, a seed planted deep, waiting to grow. And as he closed his notebook that night, Daniel whispered into the quiet room, I'm not just surviving. I'm not just building. I'm heading somewhere. For the first time, he could see it, the shore of freedom, shimmering in the distance. Daniel Carter woke before dawn, the alarm buzzing in the quiet of his small apartment. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing tired eyes, staring at the calloused hands resting on his knees. Those hands had built his life, lifting boxes, tightening straps, hauling loads day after day. They had built his fortress of savings, planted the first seeds of his forest of investments. But his body felt worn, heavy. His back ached constantly, his knees stiffened after long shifts. At 34, he moved like a man 10 years older. For the first time in years, Daniel wondered, what's the point of building freedom if I'm too broken to enjoy it? The warehouse air was thick with dust and sweat that day. Forklifts whined, pallets rattled, men shouted across aisles. Daniel bent to lift a crate, his spine flaring in protest. He gritted his teeth, finishing the motion, but pain lingered like a warning bell. On break, he sat with Javier outside, the autumn sun low in the sky. You're limping, Javier noted. Back again, Daniel muttered. Some days it feels like it's giving out. Javier sipped his water, watching him quietly. You're taking care of your money, Carter. But are you taking care of the machine that earns it? Daniel gave a humorless laugh. This machine's busted. Too late now. Javier shook his head firmly. Not too late. But listen, freedom isn't just about dollars. What good is retiring early if your body's too broken to enjoy a hike or to chase your niece in the yard? Daniel was silent, the words heavy in his chest. That evening, back at home, he opened his fridge. The shelves held cheap frozen meals, soda cans, takeout leftovers. His old diet, fast, filling but heavy and empty. He thought of Mia's laughter, of her darting through the yard, of his aching back struggling just to bend. He thought of the years ahead, the forest of wealth he was planting. What good was freedom if his body was a prison? He closed the fridge. That night, instead of takeout, he cooked rice, beans, and sautéed vegetables. Simple, nourishing, affordable. As the steam rose from the pan, Daniel realized the choice wasn't just about food. It was about respect for his future self, for his health, for the life he was building. The next week, Daniel started walking. After work, instead of collapsing onto the couch, he laced up old sneakers and stepped outside. The first walks were short, his legs heavy, lungs burning. But he pushed on, one block at a time. He began sleeping better. The stiffness in his knees eased. And slowly, his reflection in the mirror changed. Not drastically, not overnight, but in small ways. His shoulders lifted, his eyes clearer, his skin less gray. The fortress of his body, long neglected, was beginning to rebuild itself. One Saturday, Daniel invited his sister and Mia to the park. The sky was crisp blue, leaves crunching underfoot. Mia tugged at his hand, urging him to chase her down the path. Years ago, he would have made excuses, sat on a bench, watched from the sidelines. But now, he jogged after her, laughter breaking free as she squealed and darted ahead. When they finally collapsed on the grass, Mia's cheeks pink and Daniel's chest heaving, his sister smiled softly. "You seem lighter," she said. Daniel lay back, staring at the sky. "I've been thinking about how money's just part of it. What's the point of building a future if I don't have the health to enjoy it, or the people to share it with?" His sister nodded. "I'm glad you see that. Money helps, yes. But Mia won't remember how much you saved. She'll remember this." Daniel turned his head, watching Mia gather leaves into a pile, her laughter filling the air. He swallowed hard, emotion thick in his chest. She was right. At work, Daniel noticed things differently now. The older men, bent and limping, their hands scarred and backs hunched. Years of labor had paid their bills, but stolen their health. He thought of Coast Fire, of freedom bought with years of early discipline. But he added a new thought. I need to buy health too. Not with money, but with choices. With food, with movement, with rest. Over coffee one morning, Daniel shared these thoughts with Javier. "You were right," Daniel admitted. "I've been building wealth, but not life. I don't want to win the money game only to lose everything else." Javier smiled knowingly. That's the lesson most people miss. Financial independence isn't the goal. It's a tool. The goal is a rich life. In health, in relationships, in time. Money just buys you the space to live it. Daniel stirred his coffee, watching the swirl of cream. "Feels like I've been chasing survival so long. I forgot what living even means." "Then start small," Javier said. "Walk, cook, laugh. Call your sister more. Read a book. Don't wait until you're free to live. Start living on the way there." That night, Daniel sat with his notebook, flipping past pages filled with debts, budgets, projections. He opened to a blank page and wrote at the top, "Wealth beyond dollars." Below it, he listed, health, move every day, eat better, rest well. Relationships, time with family, time with friends. Purpose, learn, create, give back. As he wrote, something shifted inside him. For years, his life had been defined by money, the lack of it, the fight for it, the fear of losing it. But here, for the first time, was a vision bigger than numbers. A vision of wholeness. The weeks turned to months. Daniel continued investing, but he also continued walking, cooking, laughing. He called his sister just to chat, visited Javier, even without financial questions, read books that had nothing to do with money. Slowly, his life expanded. The fortress of wealth was growing, yes, but so too was the fortress of health, of relationships, of joy. And for the first time, Daniel felt not just free from the past, but alive in the present. The journey had begun with survival, with clawing his way out of debt, with building walls against disaster. Then came the planting of seeds, the vision of a forest of freedom. But now, Daniel understood something deeper. Money was not the end. It was the means, the soil in which a rich life could grow. And as he stood in the park one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky while Mia laughed in the distance, Daniel whispered to himself, "This is wealth, not just the numbers. This." And for the first time, he truly believed it. The warehouse was alive with its usual chorus, forklifts beeping, conveyors rattling, voices raised above the clatter of moving pallets. Daniel Carter wiped sweat from his brow, hauling another box onto the skid. His muscles ached, but his heart was lighter these days. There was purpose in the grind now, a vision stretching beyond the walls of this place. During lunch break, Daniel sat at the corner table with his thermos of beans and rice, flipping through a worn paperback. Across from him, a new hire dropped into the chair, a skinny kid, early 20s, with dark circles under his eyes. "Mind if I sit?" the kid asked. "Go ahead," Daniel said, closing his book. The kid unwrapped a fast food burger, tore into it hungrily. His name tag read Evan. "You're new," Daniel said. "Yeah, week 2. Evan chewed, then sighed. "Already feels like year 2. Daniel chuckled. "It gets easier, or you just get stronger." Evan gave a weak smile, but his eyes were distant, heavy. Over the next few weeks, Daniel noticed more. Evan's lunch was always cheap fast food, usually bought on credit. His uniform looked clean but worn, like he'd stretched it past its limits. He always volunteered for extra shifts, but still seemed broke. One Friday, Daniel overheard him on the phone, voice tight with frustration. "I don't have it, Mom. I can't. They're already charging me late fees. I'll send something when I can." Daniel's chest tightened. He knew that voice, that tone, the desperate scramble to hold life together. It was his own voice, years ago. The following Monday, Daniel sat beside Evan at lunch. "You doing okay?" he asked. Evan laughed bitterly. "Depends what you call okay. Rent's late. Credit cards maxed. They keep jacking up the interest. Feels like I'm running on a treadmill that just keeps speeding up." Daniel studied him quietly. Evan's words were nearly identical to ones Daniel himself had spoken not long ago. "Feels like drowning," Daniel said softly. Evan blinked, startled. "Yeah, exactly. How do you know?" Daniel leaned back, staring at the scuffed table. "Because I've been there. All of it. Credit cards, late rent, debt collectors. I know what it's like to wonder if you'll ever catch up." Evan frowned. "So how'd you get out?" Daniel hesitated. Part of him still felt unqualified, like he was just barely holding his own life together. But another part, the stronger part, knew the truth. He had clawed his way free. And maybe sharing it would help. "I'll tell you," Daniel said, "but only if you're ready to hear it." That evening, after their shift ended, Daniel and Evan sat in the break room with notebooks and pens. Daniel explained the basics, the budget, the emergency fund, the snowball method. "Start small," Daniel said. "List your debts, smallest to largest. Pay minimums on all but the smallest. Attack that one with everything you've got. When it's gone, roll that money into the next one. Small wins keep you moving." Evan scribbled furiously, his brow furrowed. "But I barely make enough for bills. How can I save anything?" Daniel smiled faintly. "That's what I thought too. But even $10 is a start. An emergency fund isn't about the amount. It's about changing how you see yourself. You stop being a victim of every surprise. You take back control." Evan leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Feels impossible." Daniel's voice softened. "So did my first 1,000. So did every step. But impossible isn't permanent. It's just a name we give to things we haven't done yet." For weeks after, they met once or twice a week after shifts. Daniel showed Evan how to track expenses, how to cancel and use subscriptions, how to cook instead of buying fast food. Evan started bringing leftovers to lunch. He stopped talking about drowning and began talking about climbing. The change was small, fragile, but it was real. One Friday night, Evan came running up after work, grinning. "Guess what? Paid off my first credit card. Just $300. but it's gone. Daniel felt a surge of pride, almost fatherly. He clapped Evan's shoulder. That's how it starts. One brick at a time. Evan laughed, eyes bright. Feels like I can actually breathe again. Daniel nodded, his throat tightening. He remembered that feeling. The first small victory. The first gasp of air after years underwater. That night, walking home under the glow of streetlights, Daniel thought about what had just happened. For years, he had believed his struggle was solitary, his fight unique. But seeing Evan, hearing his words, watching his small victories, it was like looking into a mirror of the past. And in helping him, Daniel realized something profound. Freedom wasn't just personal, it was contagious. Weeks later, during lunch, Evan asked, "Why'd you help me?" Most people just laugh, say it's my fault. Daniel looked at him steadily. Because someone helped me. Because I know what it feels like to carry shame, to think you're alone. You're not. And if I can pull one person out of the water with me, that's worth more than any number in my account. Evan nodded slowly, emotion flickering across his face. That evening, Daniel wrote in his notebook, "Money is power, but teaching is legacy." He sat back, staring at the words. For the first time, his journey felt bigger than himself. It wasn't just about paying off debt, building savings, or chasing fire. It was about lifting others, about proving that freedom wasn't for the lucky few. It was possible for anyone who chose it. And in that realization, Daniel felt his own freedom deepen, rooting itself not just in numbers, but in purpose. Daniel Carter had once been the man drowning, ashamed, lost in debt. Now, he was the man throwing a rope to others. And as he walked through the warehouse the next morning, past men grumbling about bills and overtime, he realized every story had the power to spark another. Every victory could light a path for someone still in the dark. And maybe, just maybe, that was the truest kind of wealth. The warehouse had a rhythm Daniel Carter had come to know by heart. The endless hum of conveyors, the steady thump of boxes hitting pallets, the shrill beep of forklifts reversing through crowded aisles. It was chaos, but it was predictable chaos. And Daniel had built his life around that predictability. Until the day the floor manager called for a meeting. The men gathered near the loading bay, sweat cooling on their shirts, faces expectant. The manager cleared his throat, voice firm but uneasy. "Listen up, everyone. Corporate's cutting costs. Orders are down. That means fewer shifts for the next couple months. No one's losing their job. Not yet, but hours are getting reduced. Effective next week." A ripple of groans swept through the group. Some cursed under their breath. Others muttered about rent, bills, groceries. Daniel stood frozen, the words echoing in his chest. Reduced hours. Reduced pay. Just like that, the rhythm he had relied on shattered. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at his notebook. The numbers blurred before him. Fewer shifts meant fewer paychecks. His budget, carefully balanced, would take the hit immediately. He felt the old fear creeping in. The same fear that had gripped him years ago when collectors called, when late notices piled high. His chest tightened, sweat dampening his palms. What if I can't cover rent? What if the bills swallow me again? What if it all comes crashing down? For a moment, he was 24 again, drowning, hopeless, alone. But then, another thought cut through the panic. This time is different. He opened his notebook to the page labeled Emergency Fund. There was 6 months of expenses, sitting safe, untouched, built from sacrifice, from beans and rice, from every overtime shift he could take. The fortress. He ran a hand over the numbers, steadying his breath. This was why he had built it. Not for peace in perfect times, but for strength in storms. The first reduced paycheck came 2 weeks later. Smaller, thinner, like a shadow of what it used to be. Daniel sat with it, calculating carefully. He tightened his budget, cut extras, delayed purchases. He withdrew a small amount from his emergency fund to cover the gap. His hand trembled slightly as he clicked transfer. For years, that fund had been sacred, untouchable. To spend it felt like breaking something holy. But as the money landed in his checking account, paying his rent without fear, Daniel felt something unexpected. Relief. It wasn't broken. It was working. Over the next month, Daniel lived leaner. He packed every meal, walked instead of driving when he could, found free ways to entertain himself. But he was steady. The bills were paid. The lights stayed on. The fortress held. One evening, he met Javier for coffee. Hours cut. Javier asked. Daniel nodded. Half of what I was getting. It's tough. But, he smiled faintly. I'm not drowning this time. I'm covered. My emergency fund's carrying me. Javier leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. That's the moment, Carter. That's when you see the difference. Storms don't disappear, but you're standing while others are falling. Daniel thought of his coworkers, the ones he'd overheard muttering about late rent and skip bills. He thought of Evan, the young man clawing his way out of debt, and he realized Javier was right. The storm was the same, but Daniel was different. One Friday, he passed Evan in the break room. The kid looked pale, stressed, chewing his lip as he stared at his phone. You okay? Daniel asked. Evan shook his head. Hours cut hit me hard. I don't know how I'm going to make rent. Daniel's chest tightened. The mirror again, his old self staring back through this young man's desperation. He put a hand on Evan's shoulder. Remember the emergency fund we talked about? I didn't build it yet. Evan muttered, ashamed. Daniel squeezed gently. Then let this be the lesson. You'll get through this storm. But next time, you'll be ready. Build that fortress. Evan nodded slowly, swallowing hard. At home that night, Daniel sat at his table with his journal. He wrote, The fortress works. I survived. But survival isn't the end. My job isn't just to stand tall. It's to help others build their walls too. He set the pen down, staring at the words. His journey had carried him from desperation to stability, from fear to strength. But now, he was beginning to see another horizon. Leadership. Not in titles or power, but an example. Weeks passed. Slowly, orders picked up again. Hours returned. Paychecks grew. When the first full paycheck arrived, Daniel stared at it for a long moment. Then he did something that made his chest swell with quiet pride. He transferred the money back into his emergency fund, restoring the bricks he had used, rebuilding the wall. The fortress wasn't just intact. It was stronger. One Saturday, Daniel took Mia to the park. She ran ahead, her laughter filling the air. His sister sat beside him on a bench, watching her. You seem calm, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. I had a scare. Hours got cut at work. But I was okay. The emergency fund carried me. For once, life threw a storm and I didn't fall apart. His sister squeezed his hand. I'm proud of you, Danny. Really proud. Daniel swallowed hard, emotion burning in his chest. For years, he had been the brother who couldn't manage, the uncle who barely scraped by. But now, he was becoming someone steady, someone Mia could look up to. And that, more than money, more than numbers, felt like true wealth. The storm had come. The hours had been cut. The old fear had risen like a ghost. But the fortress held. Daniel Carter was no longer the man drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, praying for mercy. He was the man standing steady in the storm, his walls strong, his forest growing. And as he walked home that night, cool air brushing his face, he whispered to himself, I can do this. I really can. The fortress wasn't just numbers on a page. It was protection. It was peace. It was freedom, tested and proven. The warehouse had a rhythm Daniel Carter had come to know by heart. The endless hum of conveyors, the steady thump of boxes hitting pallets, the shrill beep of forklifts reversing through crowded aisles. It was chaos, but it was predictable chaos. And Daniel had built his life around that predictability. Until the day the floor manager called for a meeting. The men gathered near the loading bay, sweat cooling on their shirts, faces expectant. The manager cleared his throat, voice firm but uneasy. Listen up, everyone. Corporate's cutting costs. Orders are down. That means fewer shifts for the next couple months. No one's losing their job. Not yet, but hours are getting reduced. Effective next week. A ripple of groans swept through the group. Some cursed under their breath. Others muttered about rent, bills, groceries. Daniel stood frozen, the words echoing in his chest. Reduced hours. Reduced pay. Just like that, the rhythm he had relied on shattered. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at his notebook. The numbers blurred before him. Fewer shifts meant fewer paychecks. His budget, carefully balanced, would take the hit immediately. He felt the old fear creeping in, the same fear that had gripped him years ago when collectors called, when late notices piled high. His chest tightened, sweat dampening his palms. What if I can't cover rent? What if the bills swallow me again? What if it all comes crashing down? For a moment, he was 24 again, drowning, hopeless, alone. But then, another thought cut through the panic. This time is different. He opened his notebook to the page labeled Emergency Fund. There it was, 6 months of expenses, sitting safe, untouched, built from sacrifice, from beans and rice, from every overtime shift he could take. The fortress. He ran a hand over the numbers, steadying his breath. This was why he had built it. Not for peace in perfect times, but for strength in storms. The first reduced paycheck came 2 weeks later. Smaller, thinner, like a shadow of what it used to be. Daniel sat with it, calculating carefully. He tightened his budget, cut extras, delayed purchases. He withdrew a small amount from his emergency fund to cover the gap. His hand trembled slightly as he clicked transfer. For years, that fund had been sacred, untouchable. To spend it felt like breaking something holy. But as the money landed in his checking account, paying his rent without fear, Daniel felt something unexpected. Relief. It wasn't broken. It was working. Over the next month, Daniel lived leaner. He packed every meal, walked instead of driving when he could, found free ways to entertain himself. But he was steady. The bills were paid, the lights stayed on, the fortress held. One evening, he met Javier for coffee. Hours cut. Javier asked. Daniel nodded. Half of what I was getting. It's tough. But, he smiled faintly. I'm not drowning this time. I'm covered. My emergency fund's carrying me. Javier leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. That's the moment, Carter. That's when you see the difference. Storms don't disappear, but you're standing while others are falling. Daniel thought of his co-workers, the ones he'd overheard muttering about late rent and skipped bills. He thought of Evan, the young man clawing his way out of debt, and he realized Javier was right. The storm was the same, but Daniel was different. One Friday, he passed Evan in the break room. The kid looked pale, stressed, chewing his lip as he stared at his phone. You okay? Daniel asked. Evan shook his head. Hours cut hit me hard. I don't know how I'm going to make rent. Daniel's chest tightened. The mirror again, his old self staring back through this young man's desperation. He put a hand on Evan's shoulder. Remember the emergency fund we talked about? I didn't build it yet. Evan muttered, ashamed. Daniel squeezed gently. Then let this be the lesson. You'll get through this storm. But next time, you'll be ready. Build that fortress. Evan nodded slowly, swallowing hard. At home that night, Daniel sat at his table with his journal. He wrote, The fortress works. I survived. But survival isn't the end. My job isn't just to stand tall. It's to help others build their walls too. He set the pen down, staring at the words. His journey had carried him from desperation to stability, from fear to strength. But now, he was beginning to see another horizon. Leadership. Not in titles or power, but an example. Weeks passed. Slowly, orders picked up again. Hours returned. Paychecks grew. When the first full paycheck arrived, Daniel stared at it for a long moment. Then he did something that made his chest swell with quiet pride. He transferred the money back into his emergency fund, restoring the bricks he had used, rebuilding the wall. The fortress wasn't just intact. It was stronger. One Saturday, Daniel took Mia to the park. She ran ahead, her laughter filling the air. His sister sat beside him on a bench, watching her. You seem calm, she said. Daniel smiled faintly. I had a scare. Hours got cut at work. But I was okay. The emergency fund carried me. For once, life threw a storm, and I didn't fall apart. His sister squeezed his hand. I'm proud of you, Danny. Really proud. Daniel swallowed hard, emotion burning in his chest. For years, he had been the brother who couldn't manage, the uncle who barely scraped by. But now, he was becoming someone steady, someone Mia could look up to. And that, more than money, more than numbers, felt like true wealth. The storm had come. The hours had been cut. The old fear had risen like a ghost. But the fortress held. Daniel Carter was no longer the man drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, praying for mercy. He was the man standing steady in the storm, his walls strong, his forest growing. And as he walked home that night, cool air brushing his face, he whispered to himself, I can do this. I really can. The fortress wasn't just numbers on a page. It was protection. It was peace. It was freedom, tested and proven. The warehouse walls loomed tall and gray, their paint chipped from decades of forklifts scraping past. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting everything in a pale, tired glow. For 12 years, Daniel Carter had lived inside this rhythm. Boxes stacked, pallets wrapped, shifts punched in and out. It had been survival. Then, for a time, it had been security. But lately, Daniel found himself looking up at the clock, wondering not how many hours remained, but what hours outside these walls might hold. The fortress was standing. His debts were gone. His emergency fund had proven itself in the storm. His investments were growing, slowly but surely. For the first time in his adult life, Daniel could ask a question he had never dared before. What do I actually want my life to look like? The question echoed in his mind during quiet mornings, during slow moments at work, during evenings when the city lights flickered beyond his apartment window. He remembered a conversation years ago with his father, long before the debt spiral. His father had been a mechanic, hands always greasy, back always sore. One night, sitting at the kitchen table, he had sighed deeply and said, "Son, life's about work. You do it until you can't anymore. Then maybe, if you're lucky, you get a few years to rest. That's just how it is." At the time, Daniel had nodded, accepting it as truth. But now, the words sat like a challenge in his chest. What if it doesn't have to be that way? One Saturday, Daniel took the bus to the edge of town, where a trail wound into the hills. He hadn't hiked in years, not since before the debt, before the grind consumed every hour. The path climbed steeply, leaves crunching beneath his boots, sunlight breaking through the trees. His breath came hard, his legs ached, but each step felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. At the summit, he stood looking over the valley, the city spread out in miniature below. The warehouse was just a speck, barely visible among the rooftops. And for the first time, Daniel felt the vastness of the world beyond those walls. That evening, he wrote in his journal, "Freedom isn't just money. It's mornings like this. It's seeing the sky without worrying about the clock." At work the next week, he shared his thoughts with Javier during break. "You ever think about what you'd do if you didn't have to be here?" Daniel asked. Javier chuckled. "Every day." He leaned back, sipping his coffee. "But it's not just about not working. It's about choosing. Work if you want. Rest if you want. That's the real wealth. Time you own." Daniel nodded slowly. "Feels strange even imagining it. Like it's not allowed. That's how the system wants you to feel," Javier said. "Like freedom's a dream for someone else. But you're proving it's not. You've built the walls. Now ask what's inside them." That night, Daniel thought about his niece, Mia. She was growing fast, no longer the little girl who needed piggyback rides, but still full of laughter and questions. He imagined being part of her teenage years, not just the tired uncle who visited occasionally, but someone present, someone who showed up. He thought of his sister, carrying so much alone, never asking for help, but always giving. What if he had more time to share with her, to lighten her load? He thought of himself, hobbies long abandoned, books left unread, dreams unspoken. And slowly, a vision began to take shape. Daniel started experimenting with small freedoms. He took a day off work, unpaid, just to see what it felt like. At first, guilt gnawed at him. But then he spent the morning walking through the farmer's market, the afternoon cooking a new recipe, the evening reading on his balcony as the sun set. The world hadn't ended. His finances hadn't collapsed. Instead, he felt alive. The next week, he joined a free community class on woodworking. His father had once loved carpentry, crafting shelves and tables from raw wood. Daniel's hands, so used to hauling crates, now traced grain and shaped edges with care. As the wood shavings curled to the floor, he felt a strange warmth in his chest, connection, purpose, creation. For years, his labor had been about survival. Now, it was becoming about expression. Javier noticed a change. "You're different these days," he said. Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm starting to imagine what freedom really means. Not just numbers. Life." "And what do you see?" Javier asked. Daniel thought for a long moment. "Time with family. Health. Maybe traveling. Maybe teaching someone what I've learned. Just not wasting my life in walls that don't care if I'm here or not." Javier raised his cup. "That's the vision. Hold on to it. That's what will carry you through the rest of the grind. But the vision wasn't without conflict. One evening, Daniel sat alone, staring at his father's photo. His father had worked until his hands shook, until his body gave out. He had never had these choices. Daniel felt guilt pressing in. Do I deserve what he never had? Am I betraying him by dreaming of more? But then he remembered his father's tired sigh at the kitchen table, the resignation in his voice. Maybe his father hadn't wanted Daniel to accept that fate. Maybe he had spoken it as a warning, not a rule. And maybe the greatest honor Daniel could give him was to break the cycle. The dreams grew sharper. Daniel began sketching in his notebook. Possible part-time schedules, ideas for side projects, visions of trips he could take. Not extravagant, just simple, meaningful. A week hiking in the mountains. A few days by the ocean. Hours with his niece, unhurried. The page filled with possibilities, not limits. For once, his pen wasn't recording debts or budgets, but horizons. One evening, his sister asked him, "Danny, why do you keep scribbling in that notebook lately?" He smiled. "Because I'm trying to imagine a life that's bigger than work. A life that's mine." She looked at him for a long time, then said softly, "I hope you find it. You deserve it." The warehouse was still there. The grind continued. But now, the walls no longer defined Daniel. He had seen beyond them, to trails, to family, to dreams waiting to be lived. The fortress had given him security, but vision was giving him purpose. And as he closed his notebook one night, Daniel whispered into the quiet, "This is what I'm fighting for. Not just freedom from, freedom to." The difference was everything.